Let's begin with the first and most overlooked truth in dealing with hot and cold behavior, the kind that leaves you confused, frustrated, and wondering what went wrong. It's not about what she said or didn't say. It's not about how affectionate she was last week and how distant she seems today. It's about understanding what's happening beneath the surface, not hers, but yours. Because the way you interpret her unpredictability determines the direction of everything that follows. Hot and cold behavior is rarely random. It's often the result of emotional incongruence, not necessarily a deliberate game. People, especially in romantic dynamics, behave inconsistently when they're uncertain about the value exchange, unsure of their emotions, or trying to assess your psychological strength. That inconsistency is how many women subconsciously test boundaries, not maliciously, but instinctively. And what you need to grasp deeply is that these moments are not attacks. They are signals, and your response to these signals either reinforces attraction or kills it entirely. Most men fail right here, not because they lack charm, looks, or intelligence, but because they take everything personally. She pulls away slightly and he panics. She becomes vague with replies and he overcompensates. This reaction is rooted in insecurity, a desperate need for validation disguised as effort. But what it actually does is strip you of your perceived value. Attraction cannot coexist with neediness. You must learn to observe without absorbing, to witness shifts in behavior without internal collapse, to remain grounded when the emotional winds change. Think about it: when you touch a flame and recoil in pain, you remember the sting. But if you observe fire from a distance, you understand its nature without being burned. The same goes for hot and cold behavior. Distance gives you clarity. You stop reacting and you start analyzing. And once you reach that level of emotional detachment, not apathy but maturity, you begin to regain control. Philosophically, we must understand that unpredictability is part of human interaction. We are not static beings. Our moods shift, our thoughts evolve, and our feelings oscillate. But when you make her fluctuations the center of your emotional world, you lose yourself. And when you lose yourself, you lose the very thing that attracted her to you in the first place, your identity. That's the paradox. The more you seek certainty in her, the less secure she feels in you, because she doesn't want to be your emotional compass. She wants to follow a man who doesn't get shaken every time the temperature changes. Now, this doesn't mean you tolerate disrespect. It doesn't mean you stay silent when boundaries are crossed. But it does mean that you no longer seek constant reassurance. You no longer interpret her pauses as proof of rejection. You operate from a place of internal validation, where your self-worth isn't on trial based on her latest mood swing. That's power, not dominance, but composure. And women are irresistibly drawn to that kind of strength. Let me be clear: emotional composure is not passive. It's active self-control. It means you've trained yourself to stay centered when most men would spiral. You recognize that her mixed signals aren't always personal. Sometimes they're projections of her own confusion or reactions to your own subtle neediness. And instead of trying to fix it externally, sending longer texts, chasing harder, asking what's wrong, you fix your internal state. You step back. You observe. You allow the distance to reveal the truth rather than trying to manipulate the outcome. This is the psychological shift. You move from chasing clarity to becoming clarity. You become the calm in her chaos, the stillness in her storm. That doesn't guarantee that she'll come closer, but it ensures that if she does, it will be on terms of respect, not pity. And that distinction is everything. So, the next time you notice her energy shift, when she becomes cold after being warm, pause. Don't rush to interpret. Don't fill in the silence with assumptions. Don't let the panic drive your decisions. Step back and ask yourself, am I reacting to her or responding to myself? Because when you stop taking her behavior as a reflection of your worth and start seeing it as feedback about the emotional dynamic, you reclaim your power. You begin to relate with strength, not fear. And from that point forward, you no longer chase interest. You command it. The moment you master your internal response to external inconsistency, you stop being a victim of emotional weather. And you become the one who controls the climate. You said, or expand key point 2 into an 800-word segment that flows naturally within the overall speech, aligning seamlessly with the other key points. The tone should be intellectual and authoritative, yet accessible, mirroring Brian Tracy approach. The language should be clear and direct, with a focus on psychological and philosophical depth. Avoid any formal headings, keeping the delivery conversational, as if speaking to an audience in a lecture or interview format. Conclude with a powerful, concise closing statement that leaves the audience with something to reflect on, motivating them to act on the insights shared. ChatGPT said, if you truly want to regain her interest, you have to first stop trying to. That may sound counterintuitive, even confrontational to the logic you've been taught, but it's one of the deepest truths in human relationships. Attraction cannot be negotiated. You can't talk someone into wanting you again. You can't reason them back into passion. The harder you try to explain your worth, the more invisible you become. Why? Because interest doesn't respond to pressure. It responds to polarity. And polarity requires one thing above all else: space. This is where most men go wrong. They feel her pulling away and think the solution is to pull harder. They think if they can just say the right thing, show enough effort, prove how much they care, she'll come back around. But attraction doesn't work that way. It's not a debate you win. It's a current you create. And that current dies the moment you shift from being the center of your own life to orbiting around hers. You have to shift the frame completely, from chasing her to attracting her. That doesn't mean manipulation. It doesn't mean playing games. It means re-centering your energy, pulling it back from her and investing it in yourself. Because when you're chasing, you're not just chasing her. You're chasing your own validation through her. And no one, man or woman, feels drawn to someone who needs them for self-worth. What she responds to isn't your words or your efforts or your pleas. She responds to your presence, your energy, your groundedness. She responds to a man who doesn't need her, but who chooses her. And there's a world of difference between the two. One is magnetic, the other is repelling. When you chase, you're signaling lack. You're saying, without saying it, you are the prize, and I will do whatever it takes to win you. That may seem romantic on the surface, but underneath, it kills attraction. Why? Because people, consciously or not, value what values itself. We're drawn to those who move with purpose, with clarity, with direction. Not to those who bend and contort themselves just to stay in our orbit. This is the philosophical core of the masculine-feminine dynamic. Masculine energy leads with presence and direction. Feminine energy tests for strength and security. When she pulls away, when she turns cold, when she gives mixed signals, she's testing not just you, but the frame you hold. And if your immediate reaction is to chase, to plead, to panic, you failed the test before you even realized it was happening. The shift begins when you realize you don't need to do more. You need to be more centered, more focused, more aligned with your own values, goals, and standards. The more you embody that, the less you feel the urge to chase. Why? Because you're no longer seeking permission to matter. You're already operating from internal value, and you're simply seeing if she aligns with that, not trying to convince her to stay. Think about this. In every high-value interaction, there's a sense of abundance. Not desperation. You're not trying to get someone. You're trying to see if the connection is mutual, if it enhances your life rather than detracts from it. That mindset is powerful, and ironically, it's what makes people lean in. It's what reawakens curiosity. Because now you're no longer reacting to her hot and cold behavior. You've transcended it. You're operating on a different frequency, one that doesn't beg but radiates. That's what attraction responds to. A man who is in motion, not toward her, but toward his mission, his growth, his values. When you shift your energy back to your path, she feels it. Even if you say nothing, she senses it. She feels the absence of your old neediness and the presence of your new focus. And that change, subtle as it may be, is far more persuasive than any argument or apology you could ever make. Now, does this mean you cut her off? No. It means you stop trying to win her. You stop performing, you stop proving, and you start living with or without her. Because once you become the man who doesn't chase, but attracts, you stop fearing loss. And once you stop fearing loss, you gain something far more valuable: self-respect. From that place, if you do reconnect, it's not out of desperation. It's from a position of strength. It's mutual. It's aligned. And if she doesn't respond, you don't collapse, you expand. Because the goal was never to get her back. The goal was to get yourself back. The version of you who doesn't beg for love, but builds a life that love naturally wants to enter. You don't regain her interest by proving your worth to her. You regain it by becoming a man who no longer needs to. You said, expand key point 3 into an 800-word segment that flows naturally within the overall speech, aligning seamlessly with the other key points. The tone should be intellectual and authoritative, yet accessible, mirroring Brian Tracy approach. The language should be clear and direct. with a focus on psychological and philosophical depth. Avoid any formal headings, keeping the delivery conversational, as if speaking to an audience in a lecture or interview format. Conclude with a powerful, concise closing statement that leaves the audience with something to reflect on, motivating them to act on the insights shared. ChatGPT said, "Now that you've stopped chasing and started recentering your energy, the next step is to rebuild your value, not in her eyes first, but in your own." This is critical because attraction isn't about proving something to her. It's about becoming something within yourself. The moment you try to win someone back through external gestures, without first strengthening your internal foundation, you're reinforcing the very dynamic that pushed her away in the first place. Value isn't claimed, it's demonstrated, and it begins with self-control. Self-control isn't just about discipline. It's about identity. It's about choosing who you are, regardless of who's watching. When a man lacks control over his emotions, his routines, his focus, he signals that he's not fully formed, that he can be swayed by attention or broken by withdrawal, that his center is fragile. And here's the truth: no woman feels secure with a man who isn't secure within himself. Emotional volatility is the opposite of attraction. Consistency, calm, and composure, those are the quiet traits that women find magnetic over time, even if they don't articulate it. To rebuild value, you have to reconnect with mission. Not her, not the relationship, mission. Your purpose, your path. This is a theme as old as philosophy itself. In every major tradition, Stoicism, Taoism, Eastern or Western wisdom, the man's journey is rooted in becoming something greater than his immediate desires. Pleasure, connection, romance. These are all beautiful, but they must orbit around something central. That central force is your mission, your personal growth, your vision, your standard. When you lose that, even for love, you lose your power. This is why the most attractive men are not necessarily the richest or the most dominant. They are the most anchored. They are not seeking approval from anyone. They know who they are, and they're building something meaningful. That kind of energy is irresistible because it's rare. Most people live in reaction. A small group live in creation. You must choose to be in that latter group. When she senses that your life is not stagnant, when she sees that you're not waiting for her to come back in order to feel worthy again, she begins to view you differently. Not because you told her you've changed, but because she feels that you've changed. You speak differently. You carry yourself differently. You don't react to her distance with desperation, but with dignity. That contrast is powerful. It shakes up the dynamic. It reminds her, and more importantly, it reminds you that your value was never lost. It was just buried under self-abandonment. Now, part of rebuilding value means confronting your own patterns. What part of you was looking to her for identity? What part of you became passive, overly agreeable, overly accommodating? These aren't flaws to beat yourself up over. They're revelations. And when you see them clearly, you can change the pattern. You stop negotiating your standards. You stop explaining yourself endlessly. You start to act from a place of grounded clarity. Whether she understands it or not, that's an important point. Rebuilding value doesn't guarantee she'll return. It doesn't promise she'll suddenly apologize or chase after you. But that's not the goal. The goal is to become a man who doesn't collapse under emotional pressure. A man who can face rejection and still expand. A man who doesn't just talk about being high value, he lives it even when no one is watching. And ironically, when you stop needing the outcome often changes. When you're no longer emotionally dependent on her attention, she starts to feel the gravity of your absence. And if there was ever genuine interest, that's when it begins to reawaken. Not because you manipulated her, but because you reintroduced something rare, a man who is no longer seeking permission to lead his own life. This is why you don't rebuild value by texting her a long emotional essay or by showing how much you've changed through words. You rebuild value by becoming the kind of man who lives well regardless of who stays or leaves, who trains his body, sharpens his mind, disciplines his habits. Not for validation, but for alignment. And that kind of man doesn't beg for connection. He attracts it naturally. At this level, you're not playing the same game anymore. You've shifted from emotional dependence to self-sufficiency, from fear to strength. And from that position, even if she never comes back, you win. Because you've returned to the man you were supposed to be all along. The greatest victory is not in regaining her interest, but in regaining your identity. And from that place, every outcome is a reflection of your power, not your need. You said, expand key point font to a 800 word segment that flows naturally within the overall speech, aligning seamlessly with the other key points. The tone should be intellectual and authoritative, yet accessible, mirroring Brian Tracy approach. The language should be clear and direct, with a focus on psychological and philosophical depth. Avoid any formal headings, keeping the delivery conversational as if speaking to an audience in a lecture or interview format. Conclude with a powerful, concise closing statement that leaves the audience with something to reflect on, motivating them to act on the insights shared. ChatGPT said. Now comes the part that requires the most patience and emotional discipline, the space. After you've stopped chasing, after you've shifted your energy inward and started rebuilding your identity, you must allow room for the dynamic to reset. Not through silence as punishment, and not through cold detachment disguised as strength, but through conscious space. Space that serves a purpose, not a grudge. This is where real power begins to settle in. Because when you stop reacting, when you stop needing constant interaction to feel secure, you create an energetic shift that's impossible to fake. The mistake most men make here is assuming that space equals abandonment, that if they stop reaching out, she'll forget about them, that if they go silent, she'll replace them. So they break the silence, they send a message, they ask how she's doing, and in that moment they break the frame they were finally starting to reclaim. Because again, they're driven by the same impulse fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of being forgotten. But that fear is the very thing that keeps you stuck in the loop of hot and cold. What you need to understand is that space is not passive. It's a strategic act of self-respect. It's the decision to stop interrupting a process that needs time to breathe. Think of emotional dynamics like gravity. The more force you exert, the more resistance you create. But when you let go, when you pull your energy back, not to manipulate, but to reflect and recalibrate, something changes, not just in her, but in you. You begin to see her behavior more clearly. You begin to feel the value of your own presence again, and she begins to notice what's missing. Now, here's the critical point. What you do in that space determines everything. If you use the space to wait, to sulk, to obsess, you're not actually creating space. You're just pausing your neediness. But if you use that space to evolve, to elevate, to grow, then by the time you re-engage, if you choose to, you'll be showing up as a completely different man, and she will feel it. Not because you say you've changed, but because you carry yourself differently. This is the moment when power starts to shift, not in a game-playing way, but in an energetic way. Because now, you're no longer operating from a deficit. You're not seeking closure, not chasing answers, not trying to convince her of your worth. You've moved past that. Your energy no longer says, please come back. It says, I'm at peace with who I am, and I'm open, but I'm not waiting. That subtle but powerful shift in posture is what attracts real interest, not pity, not nostalgia, but curiosity. She starts to wonder why you're not reacting. She starts to feel the emotional distance, and if there was ever real connection, that distance begins to draw her in. At this point, you may be tempted to reach out. That's fine, but only if it's coming from clarity, not craving. You don't re-engage to seek validation. You re-engage when you have nothing to prove, when you feel whole regardless of the response, when your inner stability won't be shaken whether she responds warmly or not at all. That's the difference between action and reaction. One is grounded in power. The other is rooted in fear. If and when you choose to re-engage, do it calmly, directly, without expectation. You're not picking up where you left off. You're not trying to rekindle an old dynamic. You're checking in from a new place with a new energy. And from there, her response will tell you everything. If she's still uncertain, still playing hot and cold, still unclear, you now have the strength to walk away without emotional collapse. Not as a tactic, but because you've outgrown the dynamic. You've built a version of yourself that no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. And if she does respond with interest, then you proceed with boundaries, not walls, boundaries. You don't go back to the same emotional rhythms. You don't become overly available again. You stay rooted in the life you've built in her absence. You integrate her into it, not revolve around her. That's how healthy polarity is restored, not through constant closeness, but through aligned distance and intentional reconnection. This is where the transformation becomes real, when you stop needing her to validate your growth, and instead, you allow your actions and presence to speak for themselves. That's the moment you're no longer trying to regain her interest. You've transcended it. You've become the kind of man who doesn't chase emotional comfort, but creates emotional clarity. And that's what she truly craves, even if she doesn't consciously know it.